Paolo von Schirach is the president of the Washington-based Global Policy Institute. He is also a professor of political science and international relations at Bay Atlantic University in Washington, D.C. He is the editor of the Schirach Report and a frequent lecturer, as well as a television and radio commentator on U.S. foreign and domestic politics and global issues. Previously, he worked at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and at the Atlantic Council. He also served as Deputy Director of the Global Security Project at Georgetown University and as an adjunct professor in the graduate program of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University.
Everyone, welcome to ALLATRA TV, and we're so glad to have you with us today, Professor Paolo, and it's a big pleasure to talk with you today.
Thank you.
And really discuss some important things which are happening, and I would say also very, very important to know you more as a person, what you live by, what your values are, what your goal are, what's the, maybe the most important purpose in your life.
All right. Well, thank you. That's a lot of issues, and all of them relevant. So, if I can tell you a little bit about my background, I'm a naturalized American citizen. I came here to the United States, and actually Washington, D.C. This is where I started my journey in America, and where I still am. I come from Italy. That's where I was born. But as my name probably can suggest, I'm sort of mixed background, Italian. That's my first name. Paolo von Schirach is actually Austrian. Interestingly enough, my hometown, even though it's not one of the most famous Italian cities, is a city called Livorno, which is on the western coast of Italy in Tuscany. In a sense, and I was thinking about it actually even recently, considering how my life evolved later on, it has the interesting history, my birthplace, as a free port. It was a free city, essentially, which was purposely created out of nothing by the then Grand Duke of Tuscany to populate a new place. And basically, with special laws, the government of Tuscany says anybody's welcome. Anybody from any country, whatever you are a Jew, you are Turkish, you are Armenian, you are whatever, everybody's welcome, as long as you bring here your skills, your trade, your ability, because we want to make this to a thriving free emporium. And so it happened. So basically, the old background of my hometown was, if I can say this, like a mini Hong Kong, okay, in the Mediterranean. It's not an exaggeration. That's what it was. And for that reason, it had, for instance, a thriving Jewish community. And I should point out that, if I'm not mistaken, it was the only city in Europe where Jews could settle anywhere. No ghetto for the Jews, which is like a reserved, specified quarter, so Jews can live only here, which shows how liberal the whole thing is. And as I said, there were Jews, there were Protestants, there were Armenians, there were Christian Maronites, anything. A very large English colony, Dutch, Swiss, a little bit of everything. And that
Very good example.
So that's an example of I would say, a successful experiment of creating literally out of nothing. There was a small, negligible fisherman's village, and that went on for quite some time. Then with the unification of Italy, which came in the 19th century, all this ended, sadly. But, but maybe some remnants of that old world survived, even though there's nothing there right now, or when I was growing up, as a child or as an adolescent, that would point to that past. But there were some signs. For instance, there's one place, a street, which is called the Dutch Docks. Dutch Docks, because that's where the Dutch had their warehouses. Okay? Imagine that. Dutch in Livorno, Italy, in the Mediterranean. What's that got to do with the Netherlands? You would say nothing. Well, there was a little testimony, if you wish, of the past, with a small Dutch evangelical church right there on that spot, which of course now it's not used. But anyway, this is the past. And also, I had the good fortune of growing up in a rather international environment. And so I was exposed to a rather, I would say mini cosmopolitan environment. I don't want to exaggerate this, but so I suppose it had some influence in my upbringing and education and all that. So, moving further along, I did my studies in high school, which is pretty common in Italy. I did classical studies, which meant immersing very deeply in the roots of Western civilization, the Greek and Roman world. So I studied Greek and Latin and history, philosophy, and all that stuff. But that, again, that's not uncommon. And later on, I decided to study further. I went into law and political science.
That's what I was about to ask. Why political science?
Well, because I thought, I was interested in understanding mostly international affairs. Some people may be more interested in other areas of political science, which is, the politics of one country, the political dynamics, political parties, ideologies, all that, which I was also interested. But I was fascinated. This was the 1970s, long time ago, in international relations, what was going on, the Cold War, the US, USSR, arms race, space race, this and that, and the NATO alliance, of which, of course, Italy, where I was born, was a member, and all that. So I did that. At that time in Italy, there wasn't much in terms of international relations studies. There was very little, which speaks to the somewhat provincial, perspectives of the country at the time. And so I said, hey, maybe there are other opportunities. I can go abroad. And so I did. First, I went to the London School of Economics in the UK and studied international relations there. And then I had applied for Fulbright scholarship to the US. Luckily, I was awarded the scholarship after having been admitted and completed the master's degree at the LSE in London. I got the good news that I had been awarded the Fulbright. And so I had choices about places to go. And I said, well, and this was my intuition. I said, well, better go to Washington. That's where the action is. That's where the government is. That's where the think tanks are. I knew very, very little. I had no prior experience, never been to the US before. I had no family. But intuitively, I knew this, that Georgetown University at the time run the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which today is recognized as one of the most important think tanks in this area, in the world, not just in America. At that time, it was run by Georgetown University. And so I figured that if I start at Georgetown, then I can, get a connection with CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International. And so I did. Anyway, long story short, I worked on security issues and international affairs, NATO affairs, nuclear policy, etc., and then many other steps. Later on, I also had the curiosity to explore the field of international development. And so I took kind of a detour from security and national defense and military affairs, NATO and what have you. And so I worked for many years on a variety of projects in international development in emerging countries, mostly in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where I spent quite a bit of time. And so I was confronted with a different world. The challenges of development, poverty, how can poor countries, which charitably are all called developing countries, but it's more like a wish than a reality. Many of the developing countries, I have to say sadly, do not develop at all. So they struggle, many different dynamics. Again, it's hard to explain everything about certain historic disadvantages, which include lack of everything. It's very hard to develop if you don't have infrastructure, a good education system, healthcare system, financial resources. How do you do it? It's very difficult. My area of interest at the time was private sector development in these emerging countries and strategies to encourage foreign investments into these countries. More easily said than done. Very difficult. It was difficult then, it is still difficult today, even though things maybe in some cases at least have improved. But this is a real challenge because these countries are behind, and it's not self-evident that they'll catch up because everybody catches up. So that was a learning lesson to understand the realities of societies that are under-resourced. And how does that improve, or what can outsiders do? My conclusion, and here there are many, many debates in this field, is that if people don't really want to help themselves, outsiders can do very little. Even if they come with a lot of money and with a lot of goodwill and resources and training and education. But if the people in that societies are not already in that frame of mind, you cannot import it from outside.
You actually bring this question about this responsibility and the shifting of the mindset, right, of the
Absolutely.
countries, and it's very important. I was thinking actually to ask you the question regarding the education, if we come to this
Sure.
end. So how do you see actually both in the United States and globally, internationally, I would say, because of course we have different levels of educations in different countries.
Of
We
course.
understand that there are a lot of common things which are happening in the educational sphere. So how do you see the future of education? How would you like to see
Well, look,
this?
it's a very strange environment. And of course, this is an excellent question. Let me say this, which may sound obvious to everybody, to all viewers, that education is key. All right? If education does not create the human capital that societies need, very little else works. That's a fundamental problem. And on this, I mean, let me point out some very obvious examples of countries that are resource poor. Take Japan, take Taiwan, okay? The most obvious one. Or even Ireland in Europe. What's in there? Nothing. Minerals, zero. Gold, zero. Oil, zero. Gas, practically zero. And so you say, well, they lack resources, And also, take Japan, mostly mountainous, not great for agriculture. Some, but not like you can be a powerhouse of agriculture like Argentina with enormous plains, or Brazil, where you can do extensive cultivation. Anyway, so how come they're so successful? Because they invested heavily and over a sustained period of time in education. They are wealthy countries, and you can debate many points, how successful or if things could be improved, but because they developed skills that allowed them to become leaders in technological innovation. Maybe not everything, not everything as good as it could be, but certainly a highly educated workforce, from factory floor workers to managers and engineers and bosses and people who run factories and big corporations and banks and what have you. They have the human capital with a sufficient or more than sufficient level of skills that allow them to grow their economy and do well in the global competition, whereby their products are coveted. And people say, oh, semiconductors, of course, Taiwan, where else? Where else do you go? Or shipbuilding, oh, that's Korea. Heavy machinery for infrastructure construction, oh, that's definitely Japan and Korea. Why? Because they're good at it. Automobiles, right? If you had asked anybody 50 years ago and said, oh, would you like to buy a Japanese car? They say, what? Does Japan make cars? Are you crazy? They make little radios. They do a lot of things. What do you mean? What do you mean cars? That's a joke.
No.
Well, look now. Toyota, Nissan, Honda, Mitsubishi, everybody. Or Korea, Hyundai, Kia, all those things. People in the past would have said, that's not possible. Who makes cars? America. Which one is the biggest car manufacturer in the world? General Motors. How can you compete with these giants? Well, you can, it turns out, if you work at it very hard. So that's background. Coming to the United States, where I live, I am very worried because we have essentially created, not deliberately, a two-tier society. There is a part of the society in which the wealthy and the well-to-do and people who have a good education and who have skills and whose careers very often are really plugged into the global economy, whether it's in finance or manufacturing or services or what have you, they're doing well. And they're going to make sure that their children are doing well. Nowadays, you have, this is anecdotes. I don't know if you are a wealthy family, I don't know, in New York City or Boston or San Francisco, whatever. You say, okay, the child is what, 4 years old? Oh, Chinese lessons, 4 years old? Yes, because we want to make sure that this child be at the top of the pile, and so they will have an excellent education, will be admitted to the best private schools, and with that background, he will have a ticket to the best universities. When he goes to Stanford or Yale or Harvard, or Princeton, Brown, Caltech, whatever, he's done. He is on the superhighway to success, just like I am, father or mother. So I want my child or children to have great success. Well, what happens instead if you are an inner city kid, okay, black or brown, and the school system, the public school system in your city is pretty bad because it's under-resourced, managed by very often labor unions whose objective is to make the interests of the teachers rather than the children. And so your curriculum is in an inner city school. You learn very little. Very often you drop out, meaning you don't even graduate from high school. What's your future? What is your future? Bad. Very often you're sucked into criminal activities, maybe petty crime, maybe small stuff. Then you start going to jail, juvenile courts and whatever. You spend time in jail. And jails, this is a commonplace, are a school of crime. And then maybe you say, oh, well, how am I going to have money? Drugs. That's big money. It's dangerous. What the hell? I'll try it anyway. And you become a member of a gang, trafficking in drugs. Enormous business in the United States. So I'm not saying that, don't take me literally. I'm not saying every poor person or low-income person in an American inner city is destined to be a criminal. No. But if you look at our prison population, it is disproportionately black and brown. Some people say, oh, it's all racism. Well, maybe, but it's also lack of opportunity that drives young people who are otherwise hopeless to do something. And if you don't have a degree, if you don't have an education, you take shortcuts, and crime becomes one of them. And that's a very sad environment, which means we are literally wasting away, if you want to put it just in economic terms, this enormous reservoir, this pool of human capital, people, their brains, okay? And time and again, it's been demonstrated if the same children from poor family, from really underprivileged environments, if they are exposed to high quality education, they function just as well as anybody else. So people, if you're racist, so it's in their DNA, it's hopeless. That's racism, meaning only certain genetic types can succeed and the others, too bad, No, it's not true. We know it's empirically not true. Many charter schools, very successful in the United States, that cater to underprivileged students, prove that if these children or young people are exposed to good quality education and committed teachers, succeed, sometimes in a marvelous fashion, which shows that if there is a chance, people will take it, okay? So that is a real problem because our education system does not prioritize these children because you go where the money is, right? And if you want to do private education, you cater to the children of the rich who can pay very high tuition to get higher quality education. And so the parents, I am a Wall Street banker, my wife is a very famous lawyer, that kind of stuff. We make very good money. We're not billionaires, but we're high income. Okay, we got the money, we can spend it. And what do we want to do? Make sure that our children do well. And so here you go. And children very often are screened from a very, very young age, which shows if you don't pass this test or the other test, okay, you go this way. If you pass the test or the standardized this, you go that way. And so sometimes from a very early age, a child is considered, but maybe not formally, a failure. No chance. He'll do something. Maybe he'll become a janitor or something, that because that's all he can do, or she, because they're not smart enough, okay? They didn't do well in their tests. And that becomes the...
This is dangerous, actually, right?
It is, first of all, it's sad.
It's sad and dangerous because you just label the child with the very early stage.
Yes.
And, you never know, everybody has their...
There are moments, there are some so-called late bloomers, people who, even in the world of very successful people, there are stories of people say, well, how did you do in school? And some say, well, I wasn't really that good. I was a C student. I wasn't really engaged. But then something happened and I became interested in this and that. And now I am a multi-billionaire, But most people want to make sure that the chances of success for their children are as good as they can be. And these children may not necessarily be geniuses, right? But with all these tutors and classes on this and classes on that, on top of what they do in school, they have a clear advantage in then gaining a spot in the top universities. So my point is this. Here in America, we still have the reputation of having some of the best super universities in the world, right? Everybody knows that. But how many students go there? There are some who are on the right track and others who are excluded. And if they're excluded, in most cases, they're excluded permanently. And so you have poor people who live in poor neighborhoods, and then maybe, they marry each other or whatever, they have children. And what do you expect those children to be when their parents have little education, little understanding about much? And those children, you expect them all to go to Harvard? I doubt it. So that's highly problematic. And I'm not quite sure if anything meaningful is being done now to end this. And in order, not because you want to take something away from people. If rich parents want to spend money on the education of their kids, who's going to say, no, you cannot do that? But offer the same opportunity to everybody. And that was something that in the earlier days, if I may digress, of the United States of America, worked fairly well. The American public school system back in the day was high quality. And very often it became the avenue for assimilation for immigrants. Immigrants became American in school because they learned the language and the instruction that they received allowed them to catch up with the native population. And so that was then. Nowadays, it's a different story. And so, as I said, even though a lot of money is spent on education, the results, I'm talking public education, okay, what is provided for by the state. There's no national system in the United States. It's all managed by the different states and different localities. It's very decentralized. So you would think people have control over what's happening, but it doesn't really work very well. And I have to say, from what I know, that the role of the labor unions that protect the interests of the teachers is not constructive. Very often you see situations in which you look at the data about student achievements which are measured. And you say in the city, I don't know, of Detroit, okay? The scores for math and science of average children this year is down by, I don't know, 15%. I'm just making this up. And then you look and all the teachers received evaluation that say excellent. So the children are doing poorly, but the teachers are excellent. Something is wrong. It doesn't compute. So these are some of the concerns that I have. But what applies to the United States, of course, applies to the entire world, because clearly education has to be a foundation, along with healthcare. Adequate healthcare has to be a foundational element for the future. The children of today are the leaders of tomorrow. So the problem is that we are throwing away literally millions of people and consider them practically second-class citizens because they just don't make it. They didn't do well with the tests, they cannot go to the good schools, and therefore they're condemned to a life of underperformance because they don't have access, lacking education and knowledge and expertise. They don't have access to the good jobs, to the careers, and what have you. And that's a very sad commentary because America, at one level, if you look at, maybe it's a mythological thing, what is America most of all? The land of opportunity. And the myth is anybody can make it here. Just a little bit of, energy, determination, hard work, you make it in America. Maybe this was never the case, okay? Let's be real. But at least that was the appeal. And what drove millions of immigrants to come here was this goal. Maybe it was a dream, because let's face it, not all the immigrants became, super rich. But at least they believed, and it was to some extent true, that they would have more chances than, especially for the early waves of immigration, which were from Europe. Europe was medieval societies in which your role in society is determined at birth. You're an aristocrat, you're good. You're in the high clergy, you're good. You're a peasant, forget it. Your father was a peasant, your grandfather was a peasant, you're a peasant. Forget, don't even think about anything else. The refreshing thing about America is that these class distinctions didn't apply, or at least not in the same way. There was flexibility. People were not judged by, oh, what's your background? Who are your parents? No, it was mostly, what can you do? Again, much of this is myth, so it's not totally true, but there was something that was true. And so poor immigrants that arrived in the US, and people said, oh, if you go west, you got all the land you want. And people said, land? Me? In Europe? The land becomes to the count, to the duke, to the marquis, to the church, to the convent. Me having land doesn't exist. I rent a little piece of land, and I'm supposed to provide free labor to my landlord. The notion that you can go west and get as much land as you want if you colonize the frontier was unheard of. And so this became I'm just saying, one driving element that led so many people who knew nothing. We watch many Western movies and we see all the covered wagons and people that go and like this. So they knew nothing. Those people were not professional explorers. They came from Norway, from Germany, from Russia, from wherever, and they had no idea what they were doing. None, except that they had the notion that their life could be better because they would be granted this opportunity at the time in which land was everything. For a poor peasant to become a landowner, it's really a big deal, okay? And this is just one idea among many. But so education is going to be the driver, inevitably, for any society in this world. And America, I think, is unfortunately wasting much of its potential labor capital, which is really human capital, by having created a two-tier system whereby so many people are not sitting at the table. And that's a sad thing because it was not designed this way. It was not supposed to be this way. But now it's a reality. It can be changed, but that would require significant investments. For instance, by allowing more of the charter schools that I mentioned earlier to operate, particularly in low-income, underprivileged areas. Because again, there is ample record to demonstrate that if those children have access to good education, they do well, just like everybody else.
If we now talk not only about education, but globally also, if you would have, like, let us say tomorrow or today, the opportunity to implement any global scale project without any limits of budgeting and like everything, what would it be, in which sphere, and why it would be this, field?
Well, quite frankly, again, I don't want to repeat everything I already said, but if there could be something, if there would be some magic something that would say, what would be your top priority in the world? I'm repeating myself, but it would be education, for sure. Because again, that's foundational. Without that, it's very hard to believe that anything else is possible. I mentioned earlier in passing the problems of underdevelopment in Africa or other places. Much of that is education.
So you will make sure that everybody has a high quality education.
Yeah, exactly. And then second priority, and this gets into a very complicated subject, but which affects mostly Western developed societies. Many economists are puzzled and they say, why is the level of growth so bad? Either non-existent or very, very little. If the, one European country, X or Y, and it says, oh, the economy this year grew by 0.5%. And people say, oh, it's not so bad. That's terrible. Why is 0.5%? And there's many issues that are contribute to these mediocre results. After World War II, particularly in European societies, but other developed societies as well, there was a new thinking about social policies, which was aimed at providing for people. And it seems to be like there's a social arrangement, a social and political arrangement to say, I vote for you, Mr. or Mrs. whatever, but you promise that you give me this and you give me that, and I want this pension and this free medical care. Of course, I also want free education, but we already covered that subject. And then a nice pension when I retire, and so that I am worry-free. And politicians said, okay, well, we're a fairly rich society. We can do that. So how do we do that? By taxation. We get the revenue to set up these systems that will provide for old people. And that seemed to be a nice political arrangement. I get your vote, but no worries, I'll take care of you. And people say, okay, all right, I'll watch. If you provide, I'll vote for you. Obviously, I'm oversimplifying this. But if we fast forward to where we are today, this system failed miserably. How so? At multiple levels. Let me try to explain, because this may be a little complicated. The state, by sucking literally so many financial resources from society to fund these programs, had very little to do anything else. So states become like a big check writing machine. We take the taxes and from the people, and we give them back in terms of pensions, or to fund large and very expensive state-run healthcare systems. This absorbs an enormous amount of resources. And as every economist would say, something called opportunity cost, meaning if you put money here, it means you cannot put it there, because money is not infinite. You always live in environmental scarcity. So that's one thing. Given very significant demographic changes, these systems don't have a chance of continuing to be financed adequately. Not only they absorb an enormous amount of resources, but they absorb an increasing amount of resources for very simple reasons. look at Europe, but even the US, or take Japan or other countries, there is demographic decline. No more babies. And the reasons for that are multiple. But quite frankly, there's been a collapse of fertility. And you say, so what? What does that mean? Well, this has profound economic consequences, because the way these systems are organized and run, it's like this. I am an active worker, okay? And I pay on my payroll tax, that's the way how it's done in the United States, but in Europe, it's similar systems. I pay into a fund that will guarantee to me that I will have pension and health care when I retire. But in the meantime, this money goes to pay for the benefits of people who are already retired. And here it gets complicated. If the number of active workers shrinks because population decline, at the same time, the older people live longer because of improvements in healthcare. So instead of getting benefits for, say, 10 or 15 years, they get benefits for 20 years, 25 years, maybe 30 years upon retirement. Back in the day, people's life expectancy was not that high, and so government could say, okay, so-and-so is retired, is 60 years old. Well, they'll live maybe another 6 or 7 years, then they die. And so after they're dead, they take nothing. But if the same person lives to be 80 or 85, that means the same person will get benefits for an extra 15 years. And where does that money come from? From the active workers. And the pool of active workers has shrunk. So the systems are no longer self-financing. What's the net result of that? Governments have to make ends meet, and what do? They go into debt. Not a new idea. It's been around for centuries. And so they do what? They issue bonds, which means I ask you to buy my treasury bonds, and I promise that upon maturity, you'll get your money back plus interest. How many times can I do this? Forever? Are people going to buy my bonds even when my debt continues to increase and increase and increase? Because I simply don't have the money to pay out of existing revenue for the services that I promised to millions of my citizens. And this is the situation facing now many European countries. It's in the news now, just happens to be 1 or 2 days ago, that the government of France did not receive a vote of confidence in Parliament because what it wanted to do, to cut benefits and raise taxes. And people say, no way, unacceptable. People need to have their money, their pensions and everything, and we'll have to find something else. Raising taxes, no. Reducing benefits, no. And so money comes from where? From the heavens? If you don't have it and you don't have ways to raise it, you really have a problem. But it's an economic problem, but also a political problem. Because the last thing any political leader wants to do is to go to people and to say, we run out of money. We need to get more from you, Mr. or Mrs. Citizen, okay? And the Mr. and Mrs. Citizen, what? More money? I already pay a ton of taxes. You want more? Then I have nothing. No. We have to find something else. But the something else doesn't exist. And that is the problem. And I think this is a problem affecting countries. In the United States here, the national debt has grown exponentially in the last few years. There was a time in which political parties said, we got to be frugal. The government has to balance its books. Running deficits is a bad idea. And if deficits grow, that's really problematic and the issue needs to be addressed. Today, the deficit grows, the national debt grows, and nobody seems to say anything. And that leads me to one point that I think it's important to note. In this environment, in which the demands from the federal budget in the United States of money, more money for social services, which in the United States are primarily three: Social Security, which is pensions; Medicare, which is medical assistance to people over 65; and Medicaid, which is medical assistance to low-income people. Combined with other minor sectors, other areas, absorb more than 70% of total spending of the United States government. This is a gigantic amount of money that the government doesn't have. And so it has to borrow every year to have investors buy United States Treasury bonds, which allow the government to pay its bills. In all this, and this brings me back to my initial interest in international affairs, security, and what have you, the biggest loser is the defense budget. And so we have seen, and it's very easy, anybody can look at a graph of defense spending as a percentage of gross national product in the United States, and you see a declining curve, whatever your timeline starts. But if you start, say, at the end of World War II, which is a good place to start, end of a major conflict, which was extremely expensive, and then you look at what happened, the Cold War, which meant increased defense spending to face the Soviet challenge, and other things, the Vietnam War, other major events, the Gulf War, 1990-91, the unfortunate, ill-fated major military commitments in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Even if you factor all this, the curve is descending. And the United States now spends 3% of GDP on defense, while in its better days spent 6 or 8%. That's a huge decline. But you can say, well, wait a minute. No, come on, you're joking. America still has the biggest defense budget in the world. Come on. That's a lot of money, almost $1 trillion. Are you kidding me? You still have overpowering military, the best technology. Come on, there's more than enough. Just be quiet, Well, it doesn't really work that way, unfortunately. And anybody who really understands these matters in detail, and I'm not going to go into the details, I promise, is this. This is an extremely expensive machine. And guess what? Where does most of the money go? You say, oh, you buy fancy missiles, fighter jets, airplanes, ships. No, you pay salaries. How's that? This is an all-volunteer force, which is kind of expensive, because to entice people to enroll in the armed forces, you have to offer monetary deals that are at least competitive with what the same person can get in the private sector. And that's only half of it. Salaries, housing, feeding.
Education.
Exactly. Providing for the families, garrison them, and then keep this machinery go on a day-to-day basis. The Pentagon, the Ministry of Defense, is the largest consumer of energy in the world. Why? How is that possible? Well, because you have millions of people working there, and they drive trucks, and they drive vehicles, and where does that come from? You got to pay for it. It's not free. It's not that the government has its own private gas station that doesn't cost anything. You got to pay for it. That's pretty mundane stuff. You want your pilots to be up to speed and be capable of meeting a challenge. You got to fly. What does that mean? Jet fuel, training, all that. All this costs enormous amount of money. Just one simple example that illustrates the point. The pride of the United States Navy are its carrier groups, which means there's an aircraft carrier that doesn't sail by itself. It has a group of ships, cruisers, frigates, destroyers. Usually there's a submarine that sail with the carrier. The carrier has all sorts of aircraft on it. There are thousands of people there, okay? Aircraft, helicopters, this and that, all kinds of things, and the other ships, whatever. Say, how much does it cost on a normal routine day of sailing? We're not talking about being at war, okay? No combat. On average, it costs about $6.5 million a day to keep this thing moving. And this is not war. This is just routine operations. A carrier group is at sea for 6 months, at least. So multiply the cost of a day by 6 months. And now you understand where the money goes. Of course, the money also goes to purchase weapons, of course, but it's not that much. Mostly it's operations. Where's my point here? That the American military, while still huge by any standards in the world, is becoming smaller all the time. The Chinese Navy right now has more ships than the American Navy. And you say, what? The Chinese Navy? Well, since when do the Chinese have a Navy? We thought it was a land-based power with no maritime interests. Well, they have a bigger fleet than American, by a significant number. Give you another little statistic. One Chinese shipyard, one, of which they have 11, produces more than the entire naval production of the United States. We've got 4 shipyards that do maintenance for US ships and 2 major companies that produce. The Chinese have 11. Why? Because the Communist Party of China can direct resources the way it wants. They don't really care about people, consumers. If people have enough new refrigerators or televisions or what have you, they care about what they care. So where am I going with this? Is that in an odd way, I hope I managed to tie this together, the enormous pressure caused by the cost of the welfare state is having, and will have an impact about the United States' ability to project force around the world. This will have enormous consequences on US foreign policy, because if you don't have the means to accomplish your objectives, you have to reduce the scope of your objectives. And this is how great powers stop to be great powers. A clear example of that would be Great Britain. In the 19th century, the biggest power in the world, look today. They're still there. They didn't disappear. There's still a Great Britain, there's still London, there's still everything, but it's a shadow of what it used to be for lack of resources, no more money. That to me is a concern. And as I said, I don't see the political debates today being focused on this trend.
Thank you so much for sharing and for this concern, because, a lot of things you could say differently. I mean, you might not think about from this perspective or from that perspective, and it's really amazing to have this dialogue, have these discussions, and to understand what is happening, why it's happening, right? So we truly appreciate you.
Thank you.
And probably, maybe there is any other important things which you might actually deliver to people, no matter of the background, no matter of what they're doing in their life. But maybe there is something important which you feel that you would like to deliver.
Well, look, I think what our societies need, and I know this is kind of a dream because we are in very polarized political environments, not just in the United States, the world over. It would be nice if people could have access to good, solid, true information. It sounds so banal. Say, what do you mean? There are newspapers, there's TV, there's this, there's that, there are blogs, there's websites. Oh, there's plenty of information, but it's a cacophony of noise. Most of it is untrue. A lot of it is biased. And I'm not saying, biased on the left, biased on the right. It's all biased. If you don't have good information, which is factual, it's very difficult to organize your thoughts. I'm talking the average citizen, rich or poor, man or woman, young or old. I'm saying it would be really, really nice if we could be, reassured that all our sources of information, whatever they are, TV, radio, online, you name it, telling you the truth, okay? And I know, come on, this is a dream. But I would think that we are now in an environment in which this is rare. And people are confused because they are fed all sorts of things which are mostly untrue, or at the very least, very biased. I am not sure how you achieve this. I have no idea, because you cannot censor information. You cannot say, oh, you told a lie. Okay, you're off the air. Sorry. Well, but I mean, it's my opinion. No. You tell a lie. Who decides? Me, the government. You can't do that. That's called censorship, you know? So how do you create a standard of information that is high quality and true? That would
Good
be,
question.
if I could do something, I would love to see that happening. But if you ask me, how would you do that? I have no idea.
Well, what about actually the people? What I mean by that is that I was also, thinking about that. Everyone has the right for their opinion. That's what you said. We
Yeah.
cannot censor it. It's impossible. But at the same time, we also know and see what is it propaganda is, right? And this kind of biased things actually, if we will see the chain, it creates the hate, it creates division, it creates polarization, it creates even worse, right?
Absolutely.
And what is the role of every citizen in a way that
They should be
of critical thinking?
Okay, this is, in principle, this sounds good. And I hear it from many people, especially media professionals. Oh, you got to check your things. You got to confront this. If you hear something, go look it up and whatever. It's not realistic. Most people don't have the time for that. Most people will not do. Yes, it is the appropriate way. Check your sources. Compare different stories on the same subject. See what looks more credible and less credible. See if this story is backed by data and facts and what are the sources. People are not investigative reporters, okay? People are not going to do that. Some are, some will. I mean, professionally, I am a consumer of information. That's my job. But I cannot expect a dentist or a farmer or an electrician to say, I saw this on this blog. Okay, let me double check that. And I'm going to spend an hour or two, cross-referencing, and they're not going to do it. It's not realistic.
We kind of really go around like
So,
really we need.
look, when I first came to the United States, there were 3 television networks: ABC, NBC, and CBS. And that was that. There was no cable, no CNN. Stuff didn't exist. And it was almost like a religious ritual that families would gather at dinner and they would turn on the evening news. And there would be this usually 3, very sort of austere-looking gentlemen, all white, but all sort of professorial, very distinguished. And they would give you the news. And the angle of coverage was not that different. I mean, these 3 networks competed with each other, okay? But it's not like, oh, this one had this views and the other one said the opposite. Not really. And in particular, there was one gentleman whose name is Walter Cronkite. And he was essentially like a mixture between your father and God. He would anchor the evening news, and at the end, he would finish the broadcast by saying, and that's the way it is. Meaning, that's it. It's settled. And people said, where did you hear this? Oh, it was on the Cronkite show. Nobody would say, oh, Cronkite lies. He's a communist agent or something like that. Or he's paid by the oil companies or by these multinationals because they want him to say this instead of that. Or the president has put pressure on the company, and so he got the message that he's got to say this and not say that. That doesn't mean that the news was totally unbiased and that all these people were perfect. But I think there was a standard of professionalism that was probably higher at that time. And the advantage or disadvantage, maybe, for the American society was that everybody got the same news. And you can say, oh, but that's not good. There's no plurality. You need discordant voices. You need opposition voices. You need people who challenge. Fair points. But at the very least, we did not disagree with the facts. We didn't say, oh, the moon shines at midday. Okay. And people say, oh my God, I watched this. Moon. Oh, that's new. Oh, moon at midday, sun at midnight. Oh, maybe it's true. You know, that didn't happen. Today, we have the equivalent of that people can say pretty much whatever they want. And they will have an audience. Maybe not a big audience, or maybe a middle audience, but fundamentally, they can say whatever they want, and there will be people who will believe it because they don't have because it sounds right to them, and they don't have the time to double check. And that's very problematic. And we do not have any modality, except for the marketplace, if you wish, to determine which sources of information are better than others. And those that seem to be good because they have a big audience doesn't mean that they tell you the truth. Maybe yes, maybe no. I'm not taking any sides here. I'm not trying to make a political argument. But I'm saying that success is not evidence of truthfulness. Success means you cook this stuff very well. You present it well. You got nice-looking people, if it's TV, you know, smiling convincingly. And people say, oh, this person looks very nice. Oh, this lady, oh, look at how pretty she is. She's all made up and she's telling me all this story. It must be true, right? Maybe yes, maybe no. So that's our problem. And the fact that we do not agree as societies, because this is not just about the United States, on what we can believe and what is untrue or at least biased, is very problematic, because a democracy is about debates on issues. And if I say that the issue is this, they say, no, that's not the issue at all. That's all propaganda. The issue is really this. And I say, no, I disagree. And then we can't even have a constructive conversation because we disagree on what we're talking about. I see this problem. I wish I had, again, a magic solution to say, oh, let's do this. I don't know what this is. I wish I did.
Anyway, I think, yeah, that's an open question for all of us. And I think that would be really great if a lot of people will just start thinking about that as a solution-oriented thing, just to how to handle this, because that's a real task. Because I understand that people do not have a lot of time, like you said. It's really true. You have to work, you have to do a lot of things, how you have to check all this information, do a fact check and all of that. But at the same time, I would say, yeah, like I like another point which you said about the high standards, which have been before for the journalism, for the TV, for all of that sphere. And I would love to see that these high standards come back. Really, we will be sure about the information and see the standards. But at the same time, I would also really like people to have a little more time so that they will also be able to check the information, be able to do, because that's also your development. That's how you learn, actually. That's how you have to somehow, right, like to learn, to check the information and stuff. And it's affecting your life, everybody's life. What I mean is that otherwise you believe on what you feed, and day by day you believe in more and more stuff. But if that stuff probably might be not all the truth or affecting your mindset and a lot of things, right? So at least to have some basic filtration, if I can say, right? And to check at least something which truly important to check. And yeah, but at least to start somewhere. That's what I'm trying to say.
Let's see how things evolve.
Yeah, that's really not an easy question, I would say. That's right. Yeah. But we truly, truly appreciate you and appreciate your time and everything you do. Thank you so much for serving the society. I know you do a lot of actually like podcast interviews and a lot of things, the research, right? And a lot of things like as a global policy institute, right? It's important to bring up the questions, to talk about them, to understand what is happening, also of course express the opinion so that the other people also will learn from it. And we truly appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Glad
much.
to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you.